Hi, Sophia. Happy Holy Saturday. It's the day before Easter and the day after Good Friday. Can you imagine how the disciples would have been feeling? How all of Jesus' friends and family would have been feeling? What a sad and scary time it would have been for them, because they didn't know what was coming next. They had to try and figure out what their lives were going to be like. So, we talked yesterday about how Jesus died. And today I want to talk a little bit about why Jesus dies. Because that and it can be a little bit confusing because sometimes God is a little bit confusing. So, one of my favorite ways of thinking about it is to be comfortable with the fact that we don't understand everything. One of my favorite ways that we see this in the New Testament is the Apostle Paul. Paul is not one of the original 12 disciples. Paul is actually, he started out as somebody who persecuted Christians. He thought that they were, telling lies and that they were dangerous, and so he was in favor of killing a lot of Christians, and he participated in that because he's a very, very committed religious person, and he thought that they were damaging and making claims about God that were not true. And so he was like, yeah, you got to weed those people out. And then Paul has this experience where God talks directly to him and says, why are you persecuting me? And he's like, who is this and who am I persecuting? And the voice says, this is Jesus. You are persecuting me. And that's Paul realizes then that Jesus is God. And then a lot of the New Testament is actually letters that Paul writes to new churches. These new little churches were springing up, and back then churches were not buildings. We didn't have denominations like Catholic and Presbyterian and Episcopalian. They were just little groups of people who believed, who would meet together just in people's houses and sing and tell the stories and worship together and be a community for each other. And they would help each other, and they would, if anybody needed something, if somebody was struggling or, was hungry, they would feed them. They would take care of each other. And which is how our communities are supposed to be today. So Paul in the book of Romans, so he writes this to the church at Rome. Remember that Rome is the big empire. And so he is trying to explain what happens when Jesus died. And he says, something extraordinary happened. Jesus' death is not just another death. Lots of people die, right? Now, lots of people do not get resurrected. So that sets Jesus apart. But what Paul says is, this is not just like a magic trick that God did where he was like, surprise, he doesn't have to be dead. He says, actually something extraordinary happened when Jesus dies and is resurrected. That is God's way of freeing us from sin. So he says, essentially, we were in bondage. We were like slaves. And he's drawing very heavily from the Exodus story, which all Jewish people knew, because remember, they celebrate Passover every year. That's one of the most important stories in Judaism. So he's drawing on that imagery, and he says, we were slaves to sin. When sin comes into the world, God created the world perfect, and he created us perfect in his image. And God is not, we say he, but we can also say she, because God is not male or female. God does not have a gender or a sex. So sometimes we use female imagery for God, and sometimes we use male imagery for God, and it's just a way of trying to understand something that is sort of beyond our minds. And so Paul says, something extraordinary happened. So we were created to be perfect, but sin came into the world. And all of us are both sinners and sinned against. So all of us have done bad things. He says nobody is righteous, nobody is perfect. And all of us have been victims of sin. And he says, because it's not just people who fell, who experienced sin. All of creation, all of the natural earth, animals, everything gets brought down by sin. So when we look at, the ways that the earth, Paul says the earth is groaning, that it's as if the earth is lamenting. And we kind of see that when we see, you could think of that as like earthquakes and tsunamis and all of these things, that it's the earth being disrupted and not operating the way that God designed it to. So he says everything has fallen, and we needed to be rescued because we were like prisoners to sin. We couldn't free ourselves. And we had tried by trying to follow the rules, and we had tried by making sacrifices, and none of that was enough. And God says, the only thing that is going to free you is me. That I'm going to come as Jesus, who's fully human and experiences everything it is to be human, but is also fully God. And that when Jesus dies, he breaks the power of sin in our lives. A lot of the older church masters said he actually, in those 3 days that he's dead, goes down to hell and kind of breaks the power, basically ransoms us. So it's like we're prisoners, and Jesus went down and told Satan, you might believe that Satan is real. I think that Satan is real. Some people think Satan is just sort of a word we use to understand evil. But he says, we had to be freed from sin, from Satan, from death, and that the way that we do that is that Jesus goes down during the time that he's dead. Hold on, because Kai needs to go out. So Jesus goes down and frees the people from hell and frees us from sin. Now, we still live in this world of time, right? And so we are still going to live with some of the effects of sin, because the work, even though Jesus completes it on the cross and is sort of this perfect sacrifice. Remember how we've talked about sacrifices, like the Passover lamb. He's this perfect sacrifice that frees us, but we still are living with a lot of the effects. And Paul says it, he says, oh, it's so frustrating that, like, the thing that I want to do that I know is right, I don't always do it. And sometimes the thing that I know is wrong, I do it anyway. And he tries to explain to people what happens, but he can't really. And Paul is brilliant. Paul is one of the smartest, the greatest minds of the first century. And he uses metaphors, which is when you say something is like something else. So he says, it's like you were slaves who got adopted and became sons. Because that would never happen, right? Like a slave is a slave. And he says, but no, now you're adopted and you're like a full heir. You're going to inherit everything that the natural born children are. And then he's like, no, that's not exactly right. Okay. It's like you got grafted onto a tree. So like there was this tree, and you're not really originally part of the tree, but God grafts you onto the tree. So now the tree has like two different types of trees growing. And he's like, okay, it's not exactly that. Okay, it's like you're a body. And everybody is a part of the body. And when one part of the body hurts, we all hurt. So he's showing us how we're all connected to each other. And he's like, that's not perfect either. Okay, the first Adam, like the Adam and Eve in the garden, he says, everybody fell when Adam fell. When Adam sinned, everybody sort of inherited that sin. That the world, that sin enters the world, and all of the pain and suffering and grief and anguish and death and misery and sickness, all of that comes into the world. He says, but Jesus is the new Adam, and just like everyone fell and entered sin with Adam, with Jesus is the new Adam. He, now we're all free and we're restored to who we're supposed to be. And at the end, Paul kind of reaches the end of his metaphors, and he reaches a point where he suddenly just sort of breaks into a praise song. He says, oh, how deep and wide and vast is the love of God. Who can explain it? And it's Paul saying, I have done my best. I have told you everything that I know. I've given you and it's not enough. My words are not enough. I don't totally understand what God did, but what I know is that God has set us free. And sometimes, as people have tried to understand, like, what exactly happened that makes Easter so important, that makes the death and the resurrection of Jesus so important, sometimes people have said, like, well, it's like God was a judge, and we had sinned, and we had to be punished, and Jesus comes in and takes the punishment. And that kind of sets up a conflict between God and Jesus, as if God's like, I can't wait to punish those people, and Jesus jumps in and is like, no, I'll take it. But that puts God and Jesus in conflict. And what we know is that God and Jesus are not in conflict because Jesus is God. And that everything that Jesus does, he does because God is pushing him to do that, is telling him to do that. And we saw that in the garden, right? He says, if there's any way for this to go some other way, this is Jesus as his human self who doesn't want to die. If we can do this any other way, that would be great because I really don't want to do this. But if this is the plan, then this is the plan. So what we see is that God is actually the one who is making the sacrifice, and the sacrifice is his own son, and it is himself because he is God in Jesus. So we are reconciled to God, meaning like our original relationship is restored where we can be in sync with God. God is the one that we need to be reconciled to, and he's the one who does the work of reconciling because we weren't able to do it. We're like prisoners who are like chained up going, help, help. And Jesus comes in and breaks the chains, and God is the one who's waiting to receive us, and he's so glad to get his children back because he loves us so deeply. And he says, you're going to be transformed by this. You're going to be fully human the way I designed you to be, the way you were supposed to be in the very beginning, with all of the fullness of your humanity, because sin eats away at our humanity. It makes us selfish and small and greedy. And he says, that was never my plan for you. I wanted so much more for you. And now you can still have that through this miraculous thing that happened where Jesus, who's totally innocent, the only person who's never sinned, voluntarily dies. Remember, we know that Jesus could have at any time said, angels, come take me off the cross. I don't want to do this anymore. And the people were even taunting him. Remember, they were saying like, oh, if you're so powerful and you saved other people, why can't you save yourself? And I feel like if I were Jesus at that point, I would be like, guess what? I'm about to be a superhero. Ba-bam! I'm off the cross. You suckers can all deal with it on yourself. Instead, Jesus just takes that. He takes that shame. He takes that mockery, that humiliation, and he absorbs it all. And because God exists outside of time, he's kind of seeing all of human history at one time. So I imagine that when Jesus is on the cross, God is looking at all of human history. He's looking at all of the terrible things that we're going to do to each other. He's looking at slavery and racism and genocide and even the small things in our life that can hurt us so much, like the betrayal of a friend, like Peter, denying him, or Judas betraying him. He's, the little things that hurt us. And he's saying, I'm going to free you from those things. I know that those things are so hurtful and they were never supposed to be part of the world. And I'm setting you apart for this is a new beginning for you where you're going to be human, fully human in a way that you haven't been before, where you get to go back to being the kind of human that I always intended for you to be. So God is always on our side. This is not God against Jesus where God is the angry judge and Jesus is like, oh, no, let me smooth it over for him. This is God and Jesus working together to say, let's liberate, let's free our beloved children. Just like God worked with Moses to free the Israelites, God is working with Jesus, who is God, to free all of humanity from our sin and from the things that would hurt us. Now, in this world, we will still experience pain and suffering. We will not fully have the freedom from sin until sort of the new heaven and new earth and, in the future. But I like to think of God looking at all of the terrible things that we're going to do to each other and saying, I will take all of that burden on. I will take all of that suffering, all of that mockery, all of that humiliation, all of that pain, and I will take it. Because you're not strong enough to take it. I will take it on, and what I will give you in return is this new life. And that's why we celebrate the crucifixion, the resurrection, is that it's not just a very sad death. It is a very sad death. But it's not just a very sad death where we're like, oh, another good person died. Because a lot of good people die. It's instead God saying, through this, I'm doing something extraordinary that you don't even fully understand. Even the smartest people among you, you're not going to fully understand it. And that's okay. Just know that I did the work. I did the work. And you are my full children. And I love you so, so deeply. And you are now set free to live extraordinary, full human lives.